This is Brian Orander with Charitable Advisors and the Not-for-Profit News. I'm pleased that you can join us as we talk to another expert about turning the page from 2020 into 2021. And today I am joined by Angela White, who is the Senior Consultant and CEO at Johnson Grossnickel and Associates. Angela and I first met many years ago when we were both much earlier in our careers, and it's been fun to be able to kind of stay in touch with her and see our organizations grow over the years. I won't tell you how many years ago that was, but we're much wiser now than we were then, I think. If you're not familiar with Johnson Grossnickel and Associates, they focus on strategic and philanthropic consulting across the U.S. That I knew them as regional, and they have now gone national. And that's really exciting. And they're based right here in Indianapolis. So it's terrific to have that expertise, right here in town. So Angela, we'll just jump in. What do you have to share with us about kind of moving into 2021 and what leaders and organizations should be looking at?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brian. It's so nice to be with you, and certainly grateful for the role that Charitable Advisors plays to keep us all connected and to think about our own leadership transitions at our nonprofits and all of the great work that you do. So thank you for the podcast and the opportunity to be with you today. I want to talk about maybe three things looking ahead to 2021 for us to keep in mind when we think about strategic planning, when we think about fundraising and campaigns and general philanthropic support in the new year. The first thing I want to give as a tip has been the JGA mantra since March, and that is the phrase, generosity is not canceled. So many things in our lives have been canceled since March, and they continue to be canceled as we are awaiting the vaccine and a safe time to come together again. And the generosity is not canceled phrase we borrowed from Sister Tracy Dugas, who's with the Daughters of St. Paul. Sister Tracy did a beautiful calligraphy of that phrase early on in the pandemic, and she happens to be a client of ours at the Daughters of St. Paul. And so that's what we've used as our mantra, and I think our nonprofits have seen that. Donors have continued to be generous at whatever level, giving of their stimulus checks, giving of their assets to nonprofits, giving what they can. And so I want us to remember heading into 21 that generosity is not canceled. So that's my first tip.
Yeah, I love that.
My second tip might seem a bit obvious, but I think it's important for us to keep top of mind in the new year, and that is to continue to reach out to our donors. So we had that moment in the pandemic, and it was maybe until the summer, where we were doing a lot of check-in calls with donors, making sure they were okay. Then we moved to kind of telling them what our plans were. If we were an arts organization, what were we thinking for a season? If we were in education, what was going to happen when school started, et cetera. And now we have transitioned to certainly having Zoom meetings. That's happened. We're asking for gifts on Zoom. We never would have thought we would have done that in our profession. Brian, when you and I met many, many years ago, would you ever thought you would ask somebody for $1 million on a Zoom call? No. But it's happening now, and it's happening successfully. And so it's almost like the donor cycle of identification, cultivation, solicitation, stewardship via Zoom. So how do we continue to stay in front of our donors and bridge that trajectory from the check-in calls all the way now to asking for gifts and stewarding during this time where we are mostly virtual? We had a little bit of time in the summer and fall where we might have done some front porch visits safely with donors, but any of you listening here in the Midwest, we won't be doing that for a while probably with the weather. So staying in front of donors and understanding that it's the new normal to connect like this, and it's okay. It's better than not connecting, and donors really are giving us a lot of grace right now to connect via Zoom and or simple FaceTime call. So that's a long tip number 2, but it's continue to reach out to your donors. Certainly, we don't know when we'll be face-to-face again, and so to keep that top of mind. The last piece is following what I just said, which is Zoom all day with your donors. I'm going to say, give yourself a break. So I've done some research on the impact of Zoom meetings on our brain and the impact of constantly being on the computer on creativity. And if we have ever needed creativity in our work, it's now, right? Everything we do, we're doing differently, and we need to be creative and think about that. But what we know is that Zoom does tax our brains more. We have to, the studies show we actually have to pay more attention when we're on a Zoom call. Our brain is more active than when we're meeting face to face. And so a couple tips. One is give yourself some breaks between Zoom meetings. Get outside, walk around, walk from one room of your house to the next, and find the space to give your mind time to simply wander. We know if we allow that, that's when our creativity is at its. So stay in front of your donors and build in some breaks for your own creativity to begin to flourish as we think about the new year. So those would be my 3 tips.
Those are terrific. As you were talking about the give yourself a break, I have seen some of that research also around Zoom, and one of their tips was anything you can do to minimize the picture of yourself, because some of that is we're not used to looking at ourselves as everything else is going on. So
that is such a great tip. You know, I've said to so many people, if I never have to look at myself again in a meeting, I will be more than happy, right? And so that's a good tip too, because you're not only trying to focus on the person you're meeting with, but looking at yourself as well.
Very good advice. Well, I wonder if I might also ask you to maybe share an example of something kind of that's happened this year that might be a little bit more specific. I don't know if we call it a success story or just kind of some of your experience here.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that, you know, you and I would have never thought we'd be soliciting gifts on Zoom, right? And so think about that. If as the paid staff person that's uncomfortable or unknown, maybe is a better word, think about our campaign volunteers.
Sure.
First of all, they're challenged to do it face-to-face sometimes, let alone now having this virtual opportunity and sometimes seen as a barrier. So I think one of the things I would share as either a success or just a specific aha moment to share today is helping those volunteers feel ready. If you are at the stage, either in a campaign or simply in your annual giving program, where you're utilizing volunteers to make peer-to-peer connections, how do we help them be comfortable to do that on Zoom? And so I have one particular client that was really ready to move into a regional phase of a campaign, and they were using volunteers across about a 3-state region to meet with donors in their geographic locations. And it was really difficult. I mean, the volunteers wanted to pause. Let's just wait. Well, if we were just waiting since March, you know, we're going to have a whole year of waiting in this campaign. And if you go back to Generosity is Not Canceled, we don't want to wait, right? We want to appropriately ask people to join in and to share their riches. So what we did was first help those volunteers feel comfortable on Zoom by obviously having our own meetings with them on Zoom. So getting them comfortable with technology, helping them to understand how that can work well. So just making it routine for them before we said, now go meet with Brian, you know, on Zoom, right? The second thing we did was have the staff share their stories about how their meetings with donors were going on Zoom. And again, I'm saying Zoom because that seems to be the most common platform right now, especially that our volunteers feel comfortable with. I know there are lots of other platforms, certainly, that you can use. But the staff then shared stories with the volunteers about how well it worked and that the donors on the other end kind of just expected this kind of contact. Also, we said to the volunteers, you know, it doesn't have to be Zoom if you know the person well enough and you think you can just have a phone call. And so that's happening too, as well as, again, going back to what seems now like old technology, but a simple FaceTime call. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I think one of the things that I've been really proud of, especially in that client situation, is helping our volunteers pivot, using a COVID word, from the face-to-face, we've got to go have coffee, or I'll be over to your home or your business, to being willing to have prospective donor conversations on Zoom. So again, it's one thing for us to leap to that, but then to help our volunteers be comfortable and leap to that. So now this client and this campaign, they're in a spot where we have to hold back a few of the volunteers. They're like, okay, I'll talk to this person and that person, and we're not ready. And that's a great place to be. So I just share that. And the other thing I would share when we think about our volunteers is, boy, COVID's been hard on volunteers. They can't be in your museum or in your hospital or in your school, right? And so how do we keep that connectivity with them? And we also know when you volunteer, you are about 3 times more likely to make a larger gift. So how do we repurpose even our volunteers in COVID? So that might be a separate topic for another podcast, but that's what I'd share as a success story or another tip for 2021.
Terrific insights. And I wondered if the outcome of kind of that equipping and engaging the campaign volunteers, what their experience would be. And it sounds like they had positive experiences, as we would generally expect. And I bet there are some ways that it might actually be easier to have a conversation, over Zoom once you get into it. And since we all have this common experience of COVID right now, that there's certain aspects of that probably that went pretty smoothly.
Well, and the other thing is, we structured this by geographic region, not because it was closer for the volunteer to get to the prospect, but because they knew the prospect, because they lived in the same community. But you could certainly, I've got another client that is a university client, and you went to school with so-and-so, but she lives in Seattle and you live in Indianapolis. You probably aren't going to assign me to her, but now you can, because travel's not an issue. So there's a whole nother opportunity to think about volunteer engagement across the geographic boundaries, because now we don't have those. So anyway, I'm not saying we won't ever be face-to-face again, but we should look at what we've learned from COVID and the pandemic work that we want to keep. What are the positives that we're not just going to go back to the way it was?
Right. Yeah, I think it's terrific. I mean, a similar silver lining. I'm working with a client right now in strategic planning. As part of the process, we usually try to kind of benchmark or visit other similar organizations. Mm-hmm. And in the past, they've thought, well, who can we drive to within a couple hours in a van? And now they're saying, well, since we're not going to go in person anyway, they're really cutting edge in Colorado or Pennsylvania, or we know people there that we've met through conferences, and so they're going to have different conversations. The tour piece feels a little trickier to figure out, but the conversations are really good. So that's great. We'll kind of wrap things up here. Again, this has been Angela White with Johnson Grossnickel and Associates. Thank you so much for Angela for sharing your wisdom with us, and we look forward to a terrific 2021, certainly compared to 2020.
That's right, Brian. Thank you for all you do for us and in the charitable giving community. And it's a pleasure to be a part of the podcast series.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.